to this virtual Women's Seven Side event at a high-level political forum with the title Care to Build Back Better, Anchoring the Gendered Care Economy in the Center of COVID-19 Recovery. And as you noticed, we record this meeting for documentary purposes, and it will be available on our website. My name is Caroline Ausserer. I'm the W7 coordinator. The Women 7 is an official engagement group of the G7 and brings together over 60 representatives from over 20 countries. And this year, the National Council of German Women's Organizations, in German Deutscher Frauenrat, is hosting the W7 dialogue during the German G7 presidency. And what did we do in the last months? We formulated together with all these advisors powerful demands on gender equality to the G7 leaders. And we handed it over the communiqué to the G7 president and German Chancellor Olaf Scholz at our summit in May. So it's really important to mention that the pandemic has set back progress to gender equality by a generation. And we really think this is also where G7 have to act. It's remarkable, however, that the German government has chosen to put a focus on care. And we remember the successful G7 Care Conference in April, jointly hosted by Germany, UN Women, and ILO, which essential message was to all the G7 leaders: we need to make sure the recovery is gender just and helps to build fairer societies. Actually, that's our vision of a G7. A G7 could have transformative power for a more equal and just world, not only between the genders, but also between North and South, taking our responsibility into account in terms also of legacies of colonialism, bringing women, girls, and gender diverse people into decision-making spaces together, creating a more inclusive, resilient, and egalitarian societies for future generations. So I've just returned recently from the G7 summit in the Bavarian Alps, and where we waited quite anxiously to receive the G7 leaders communique. And if we look at this leaders communique, we see that they have taken up several Women 7 demands. So they have almost verbatim found their way into it. So that's quite a good news. So for example, for the issue of today, the leader recognized the central role of care for the functioning of the society, also paid and unpaid care. And they also address the key causes of gender inequality, and they say it's due to unequal distribution. So, but, and there's always a but, the communiqué, in our view, lacks concrete financial and structural commitments, and that is what is needed. So the gendered impacts of the various current crises need to be addressed. And it's important to monitor also the implementation of the commitments. And there we very much welcome the dashboard about which I'm sure we will talk about later on. Because we need to monitor what has been promised and to see how does this progress on gender equality move, or is it stuck? And then we need to expand these demands from the G7 to the G20 to the UN, because 2030 is around the corner. So I can only repeat Women 7's appeal to the political leaders. It's time to deliver, and the time is now. And the last word, the German G7 presidency is far from over, so we already look forward to the exchange with G7 representatives at the meeting at the Gender Equality Ministers in October, and there will be several other ministerial tracks, and we will critically accompany these processes and take every opportunity to remind the leaders to deliver on their promises. And then, when the G7 presidency is handed over to Japan, we will also closely cooperate with our Women 7 colleagues and to ensure a sustainable handover of knowledge and processes, just like Jessica, here my colleague, Jessica Woodruff, who was the W7 co-chair last year and who is the moderator today, and her colleagues, how they did last year. So we really believe that the focus on the role of underpaid and unpaid care work must remain at the center of COVID recovery discussions. And I look forward to a very fruitful discussion today. Thank you all for joining us today. Jessica, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Caroline. And thank you to the German W7 for organizing this panel on this really important issue. As we know, the care economy lies at the heart of feminism, and it's an interconnecting web covering every aspect of our lives, from health to food, to water and sanitation, from childcare to elder care, and the care we all need to sustain us. And I think what's important as well is that it takes the form of unpaid domestic work, but also underpaid care work, voluntary community care, the provision of public services, right through to macroeconomic decisions that shape our economies. And we're therefore delighted to have a panel who's able to approach these issues from all sorts of different perspectives. I'm going to introduce each of our panel before I speak, because otherwise you'll forget who they are in between. As you heard from Carolina, the German presidency put discussions on care really at the center of G7 deliberations, which was really positive, I think. However, the only specific commitment that they made was on contributions to the World Bank Childcare Initiative Fund, which is really quite partial and quite a problematic response. So I think now the time is for us to start talking about solutions. The issue of care is there on the political agenda, but what do we want governments and international institutions to do? How do we ensure that economies and societies start valuing and investing both the provision of care, but also those who provide it? And just to kick off the discussion, I'm going to tell you what we put in the W7 communique around the care economy. We called on governments to adopt transformative economic policies that address structural barriers to gender equality, to recognize the value of unpaid care work across policymaking and reduce women's unpaid care burdens through gender transformative public care services. And we called on governments to invest an additional 2% of each country's GDP in social infrastructure. So that's just what was one part of the W7 communique, although, as I said, it's such a web of issues around care that there were other things as well, and Divya will come on to that later. So now to our panelists, we're going to give you each 2 to 3 minutes to speak, and I will try and keep you to time if that's okay, just so that we have time for questions. And then when the panelists have spoken, do put your questions into the chat box, and then the W7 team is going to collect them and read them out. I'm very pleased, first of all, to welcome Anita Bhatia. Anita is Assistant Secretary General and Deputy Executive Director of UN Women. Prior to working at UN Women, she held various senior positions at the World Bank, working around the world. And as I'm sure many of you know, UN Women has done really important work on care, I think particularly in their research and data department. And really, if those of you who haven't seen some of the reports that the research and data department have put out, I do recommend having a look at them. I know Anita has to leave early because she has other commitments. So what we're going to suggest is that if you do have a couple of questions for Anita, do put them in the chat box while she's speaking, and we will come back and do a couple of questions to Anita first, and then we'll go on to our other panelists, if that's okay. Okay, Anita, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Jessica, and thank you so much to the W7 for convening this panel discussion on a really, really important topic, which I agree with you, Jessica, has not gotten enough traction in terms of actual commitments and actions that are going to move the agenda forward. And look, let me start by saying that one of the silver linings, if we can call it that, of the pandemic was that it really shone a spotlight on the care burden issue, because those of us who've been working in this area have known that it's an issue for a long time. And thank you so much for acknowledging UN Women's leadership, particularly the leadership in our research work, because actually when I think back to some of the reports that we have published, our flagship report, which is what we call the Progress Report, which highlights progress on various women's issues, we were talking about this issue before the pandemic. And what the pandemic did was it showed it was very real, because suddenly policymakers, the kinds who are at the G7, were at home watching how unequal the burden of care was. And so I think we have to be very thankful that this is actually now on the public policy agenda. And I do want to acknowledge Germany's leadership, which you alluded to, Jessica, in pushing this agenda at the G7. So it's great that it's gotten on the agenda, and it is very much needed, not just in G7 countries, but actually all over the world. And it's needed because we have data that clearly shows the correlation between the number of jobs that women have lost as a result of the care burden and the correlation between female labor force participation, which pre-pandemic had enough structural constraints around it anyway, but these have been exacerbated because the correlation between women's labor force participation and the care economy has never been clearer. It is crystal clear now that one of the reasons that we have seen women stepping away from the labor force is because the care burden has simply become too large. And we also have data which shows that this care burden, surprise, surprise, is not shared equally between men and women. And while there may have been some increments in male participation in care duties and care burdens during the pandemic, at no way and at no level is this matched by the level of increase of the female care burden. So I think what is really key at this point is not just investments in the very well-intended, and I'm sure will be very well-functioning World Bank Childcare Fund. It is making this a public policy matter for every single country. Now, there are countries that have begun to do this post-pandemic: Uruguay, Argentina, Mexico. UN Women runs, as many of you may know, with the government of Mexico, the Global Alliance of Care as part of Generation Equality. And that brings together a range of partners across the spectrum: governments, public governments, private sector, civil society, to push for the agenda. The great thing about the examples from Uruguay, Argentina, Mexico, etc., is that when there is political will, it can actually happen. And so I think we need to make sure that we are keeping this on the public policy agenda, which tends to get crowded out by bigger issues: climate, recovery, inflation, food prices, fuel prices, as a result of the war. So this gets crowded out. So we need to work to keep this on the agenda. Second, we really do need to share examples widely of what things are working. Because if Argentina, Mexico, Uruguay, Chile, Kenya, others can do it, so can many other countries. Third, we do need to recognize that care means different things for different economies depending on their stage of development. What care work means in a developing country is very different from what it means in a G7 country. And that's because of the burden of informality and because so many women are in the informal sector in developing countries. So care means a completely different thing there. And we need to be very mindful of these nuances and not assume that a one-size-fits-all approach is going to work. It will not. Fourth, we need data. This is why I was so glad, Jennifer, that you mentioned this report that UN Women has just come out with, because it shows exactly what governments did in response to COVID-19. How many of the stimulus packages actually had measures for women? How many measures reached women? And how many policies, I'm not going to go into the details here, but people can read the report, but how many policies were actually successful in making a difference in women's lives? And the answer is, even in countries which have gender-responsive budgeting, and they're not millions, or not hundreds of those, but even countries that have gender-responsive budgeting don't actually do a very good job of getting resources into the hands of women, let alone addressing the childcare burden. Final point that I would want to say is that your point, Jessica, on investment and social infrastructure is absolutely right. And that social infrastructure investment has to be comprehensive. It's health, It's education, it is payments for paid care, but it is also recognizing the importance of the tax system and ensuring that the tax systems are set up in such a way that they can actually fund these investments, because there's a huge variability in spend on social sectors across countries. But one thing is clear, that unless there are fundamental changes in how you actually tax citizens, you will never have enough resources to be able to make those social infrastructure investments. And to do that, one last thing I do want to say is that why are we spending so much on defense? Yes, we need to do that when there is a war happening, and that is needed now. But as a long-term strategic imperative, the money we spend on bombs and rockets should be spent on people.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Anita. And that was such a clear presentation about the different things that need doing. Had you been able to stay till the end, I was going to ask you about next steps, but I think you very articulately defined what the next steps should be. So thank you. You preempted my question. I let you go a bit over time there because you are having to leave. But so I think perhaps, but rather than taking any questions, we should move on to Divya, if that's okay. Thank you so much, Anita. That was really clear and helpful. I'm going to turn now to Divya Matthew, who leads Women Delivers Policy and Advocacy Strategy and Programs. Her focus there is especially on gender equality, health, sexual and reproductive health and rights, climate action, and economic justice and rights. So just a small portfolio. And she is also one of the W7 advisors this year. So she's going to be able to speak about a bit more about what the W7 has been doing. And Divya, can you explain a bit more about what actions are needed to guarantee sexual and reproductive health and rights as an important part of care provision?
Thanks, Jessica. I do have the honor of wearing the W7 hat and representing over 60 fierce feminists in their asks around many things, including the care economy. Just to sort of set some context on the role and the linkages between SRHR and care, there's a lot of work done on how they're closely related, but just very simply put, without access to contraception and safe abortion services, childbearing persons cannot choose if and when and how many children they would like to have, which can increase their care burden. And so in any conversation about centering the care economy and pandemic recovery, we also must address some of the root causes of these structural inequalities and how we can work cross sectors to address challenges like unequal care burden. And so in light of this, safeguarding SRHR is vital. The W7 advisors did call for an increased focus and access to funding for SRHR, but also a focus on repealing discriminatory laws that challenge our essential access to reproductive health care. We've seen in the pandemic, there's been a terrible impact on people's access to SRHR with global disruptions to contraception and safe abortion services. And so what needs to be done? I'd like to focus in on a few of the W7 asks. One is really focusing on strengthening gender responsive public healthcare systems through universal access, health coverage, and ensuring that SRHR is an integral part of UHC. And this ranges the full range from modern contraception to adolescent youth-friendly services, and also programs to prevent GBV and harmful practices. But safeguarding SRHR also depends on strong and gender equal health and care workforce. I think many a times when we talk about the care economy, we I think underestimate what a sizable portion healthcare workers take. And the challenges to that. Just today, Women in Global Health has released a report that says 6 million healthcare workers who are women have often underpaid and unpaid care, which essentially subsidizes global health through their underpaid and unpaid labor. And typically these women are from low-income families, with limited education, working as community health workers. And we've all seen what a crucial role women have played in the pandemic. And so just looking at how do we address some of these burnout issues, one is having access and opportunity to equal decision makers, decision making and policy making. How do you ensure safe and decent work for female and gender diverse healthcare workers? How do you expand opportunities to gender responsive training and retention? And also just echoing Anita's point on really collecting and using disaggregated data with a focus on intersectionality, so we really learn from what's working and what's not. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Sivya. And it's really important there, I think, talking about health workers and the crucial role that they've played in the crisis as well. Thank you. We're going to move now to Memory Kachambwa, who is the Executive Director of FemNet, the African Women's Development and Communication Network, which I'm sure many of you have heard of. FemNet's a Pan-African membership network addressing a range of issues related to care, including economic policy, and they recently launched the Africa Care Economy Index. Memory is a Pan-African intersectional feminist and women's rights activist with over 18 years experience. And Memory, I wonder if you could tell us a bit more about the context of sub-Saharan Africa. As Anita mentioned, the context of care is very different in different regions, and it's something that I think perhaps sometimes people in the global north forget is that we each even in our national context have quite different care needs. Perhaps you could say a bit more in the sub-Saharan African context what the priorities are on care and what the international community and particularly G7 states need to do to move towards a gender equitable care economy.
Thank you so much, Jessica, and really to thank Anita for recognizing that no size fits all. But also, I think in a presentation, Anita also mentioned that there has been quite some work that has been done on the continent in terms of care work, especially some responses that we saw. So I'll speak a bit in terms of why it is really overdue in terms of the commitment to care on the continent, because we know that Africa is identified as the world region with the most unshared system of care, where you find 70% of care providers being provided by women within the family. And when you also look at the framing in some of the responses around care work on sub-Saharan Africa, some of it does not actually include a framing which can accommodate labor, where we find that a lot of women are engaged in the agro sector and that they do a lot of labor, which also is constituted within the care scope. So in that way, we also came up with the Africa Care Index that you referred to. And in this Africa Care Index, we're measuring against 10 metrics, looking at maternity and parental leave, socialized care for the elderly, socialized care for people living with disabilities, socialized health care, socialized food production, COVID care measures, domestic work protection, care grants and subsidies, especially within the COVID context, and also looking at family care leave. So it's a scorecard which was now looking at how different countries were scoring. I won't go much into details given this time, but also maybe just to highlight that also when we look at some of the data coming out is that African women and girls still perform 67 to 92% of total unpaid care work done. And when you look, when I saw the time use survey results for Mali, this was in 2008 though, where 92% of unpaid care and domestic care is really great and huge and really unacceptable when you think of it. But most of the countries have also not done a lot of time use survey. But for those that have done the Time Use Survey, the percentages are really high in terms of the amount of care that is done. And really, this really affects the ability of women and girls on the continent to engage and remain in paid employment, and also participate in the political and public life, and also for their well-being, as well as to attain full education. And we know with the pandemic, it really recast the light in terms of how care has been invisible, and really the normalization of female unpaid labor as a response to most of the major needs, from supply of fuel, food, and water. And this really tends to accentuate other outcomes of violence, and also when you look at caring for the elderly, not just COVID pandemic, but also the HIV pandemic as well, and also other pandemics on the continent. If you also look at, for example, between 2010 and the working age population in Africa is also going to increase, and that's big demographic divide is going to have a lot of young people, and that is also an opportunity in terms of really investing in care so that it can create more jobs as well. I think when also regards to what are some of the demands, I'll just talk about really the need for also increasing the resources, because most of the time when you talk about care, the question is, where can resources come from? And I think in Africa, most of our resources are lost through illicit financial flows. So being able to harness the illicit financial flows, ensuring that taxation is one of the most sustainable and predictable source of financing for the provision of public goods. So on also harnessing that as well.
That's fantastic, Memory. Thank you. And we'll have time to come back to some of those really important issues, I think, in the future. And I think as we go. And I think also really important that you mention the impact of unpaid care, not just on women's ability to take paid employment, but also on their political activity and other aspects of their well-being, because we sometimes over-focus, I think, on female labour force participation rather than women as a whole. Anita, I know that you're about to have to leave, so if we can just say thank you very much for joining now, and congratulations to you and women for the good work that you do on this issue.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry to have to leave, but I really enjoyed the discussion thus far. Wishing you the best for the rest. Thanks. Bye-bye now.
So I'm going to move on now to Dr. Petra Vollmer-Otto. And she's our representative today from the German government, which hosts the G7 this year. And she is Director General for Gender Equality at the German Ministry for Family Affairs, Senior Citizens, Women and Youth. I'd like to ask you, first of all, you will have heard all the previous speakers. What do you think that the G7 states should do to provide the necessary transformation of the care economy, both domestically but also internationally, that's so clearly needed? And what are the possibilities and obligations of the German presidency of the G7 in this regard? Sorry, we can't hear you. I can see you're not on mute, but...
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, perfect, thank you.
Perfect. Yeah, thank you very much, Jessica, for the question, and thank you very much for inviting me to this event. It was very interesting to hear the different aspects and perspectives mentioned by the previous speakers. So you asked me what to do most urgently, and I'd say for the international as well as the domestic level, the first step, but the indispensable step, is awareness and accountability. And I think the G7 dashboard on gender gaps that has been already mentioned by Caroline in her introduction the dashboard that was endorsed by the G7 summit last week is a major step forward in the right direction. Because for the first time with this mechanism, the G7 states have committed themselves to a quantitative monitoring of their progress in to achieve gender equality. And you certainly know that indicator 5 looks especially on the gender gap in unpaid care. So, and it is also mentioned that the equal sharing of unpaid work between women and men is of highest political priority to the G7. So I can only underline that from a German perspective, but also for the G7 leaders, this commitment to keep the issue of care on the agenda is really a very positive outcome of the summit last week. The G7 leaders have also acknowledged in their statement that the COVID pandemic, and let me cite the outcome document here, the COVID-19 pandemic has disproportionately affected women and girls and has highlighted the essential role of care work, both paid and unpaid, for the functioning of our societies and economies, but also as a key cause of gender inequalities due to its unequal distribution. So really the interrelations between the care issue and other issues on gender inequalities is also mentioned and acknowledged in the leaders' statement. As was mentioned before, also the G7 leaders committed themselves to expand global access to quality childcare infrastructure, including their collective support for the Childcare Incentive Fund. I would hereby mention that the statement says including, but not limited to. So I think it's a commitment that G7 leaders will have to keep on their agenda and to strengthen their commitments here also in the future. So what we need is, of course, the accountability of states, but we also need a vivid and strong civil society. And I think the Women 7 process for years now is a very good example how much civil society can contribute to international processes. And with the strong support of the German government of the several civil society tracks during the presidency this year, I think we also underlined this fact, how important that is. And we also strive to support that the support will be carried on also under the next presidencies.
Thank you.
So may I make 3 points for the domestic level, because you also asked me what to do on the domestic level. Here I would say for Germany it's maybe three important avenues or points. One is the investment in a high quality professional childcare. And I'm very happy that we are able to uphold and strengthen our domestic commitments here, also in current times where national budgets are more and more tense. This is very important that national governments keep the issue on the agenda, the investment in the infrastructure. We have to ensure decent work and decent wages for care workers in the professional sector and also in households. And we have to put in place strong incentives for couples for a fair distribution of unpaid care work in the families between the partners. So this is the major 3 avenues that the German government will continue to follow. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And there are lots of things there for further discussion. I think particularly we might come back later to think about the G7 commitment where, as you say, it only said including the World Bank initiative, and perhaps we can think about what other things it might be good to suggest to the G7 next year. I'm going to keep us moving if that's okay, so we have time for questions. Our next speaker is Emilia Reyes. I'm just waiting till she comes up on, there we go. And Emilia is Programme Director for Policies and Budgets for Equality and Sustainable Development at, and sorry, I'm going to not say this very well, Equidad de Género, Ciudadanía, Trabajo y Familia, which is gender justice, citizenship, work and family. She was one of the organising partners of the Women's Major Group for the Agenda 2030 and has co-chaired the Women's Working Group on Financing for Development. Emilia, do you think we're doing enough? What needs to happen to ensure a truly transformational approach to the care economy?
Thank you so much, and it is an honor and a pleasure to be here with all of you. Let me take some steps back to say that an economy that is mindful of care also needs to be mindful of life. And so far, we have been thoroughly anthropocentric without bearing in mind to taking care of life in this planet as well. And this framework in my background shows the amount of the burden that women carry. This is the value generated by unpaid domestic and care work, and this is just the monetized economy. So what the formal economists recognize is this, whilst women are carrying this. But this is not only about the value of money or the value of work, it's also about what we are taking care of, and that is related to our planet. And developed countries are responsible for overshooting 93% of the global carbon emissions in the world. And they're also responsible for the overshoot of material resource use in also 93%. That means the entire devastation in the world is in the responsibility of developed countries. And so this is something that needs to be related to women's rights, because it is actually women's in the global south, especially in the LDCs and in the islands, the ones that are carrying the burden of all of the human rights violations that have been committed by countries in the global north, by the predatory actions that they're committing in the global south by means of their extractive practices and their excess use of energy that comes paired up with this energy tiering. So we cannot just talk about care or sexual and reproductive health and rights or labor rights without bearing in mind this larger threat that we are facing in the world. And the IPCC report as of late said that we only have 3 years to shift the entire economic system. And that means the growth for the rich, not the entire system in the global south or the poorer countries. That means the growth for the rich, because we need to lower down 43% of our gas emissions by 2030. And that means that the global north needs to be held accountable for what it's doing. And just wanted to mention, it's very a pity that the representative of Young Women has left. They just recently partnered with BlackRock. And that is not something that we are expecting from UN Women in a time when the major holder assets is actually suing governments like Sri Lanka or Kenya, who are trying to uphold to their international commitments on SDGs, on the Paris Agreement, to deliver public services. Even the New York City was running against a lawsuit by BlackRock. So I think it is really important that we understand that women are not living in isolation. Our rights are not living in isolation. And at this moment, we also don't want the G7 to make decisions for us in the global south. We need for them to take responsibility of their extraterritorial impacts and to really also work on reparations. There are demands on loss and damage finance, and then there's the new goal on climate finance. We need them to really step up for what they're doing, for what the damage they have harmed. And this will in turn bring women's human rights to the table. And of course, in an economy that is mindful of care as of life. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Emilia, for bringing together the kind of sustainability agenda, care agenda, and decolonization agenda. And as we know, they're all very closely linked together. And in fact, on that point, Memory, I wanted to come back to you, because one of the things that we tend to do is talk about what governments need to do in care without talking about how they're going to get the resources to do it. So perhaps you could say a bit more about the transfer of global resources from north to south and what's needed.
Yes, so thank you so much, Jessica. I think one issue that is really pertinent is the issue around the debt. So you find that there's a huge debt burden on the continent and for a lot of global South organizations. So really for G7 countries to look into that and to ensure that because most of the global, or I'll speak for the continent, they prioritize paying their debt vis-a-vis investing in social protection. So I think that is one. And I think Anita also mentioned something very important around the militarization and the investment that we see in the military sector vis-a-vis in preserving life and also ensuring that the same countries are the ones who are really promoting a very extractive agenda. And when you look at currently even the whole move to the green, to the whole green revolution, clean energy is going to require an extraction of minerals. And those minerals, most of them are sitting in the global South. They are sitting in the continents, in Africa, and those countries with such minerals, there's a lot of instability and not so much support in terms of really ensuring that there's harnessing of resources. So where we can get the resources, like I mentioned before, really curbing the illicit financial flows that we do know most multinational companies of G7 countries are perpetually recolonizing the economies, and also I think re-looking at expanding the definition of GDP, of growth. I think the capitalist model, COVID really showed it, but there seems to be not much tendency. Yes, we've seen the commitment for a K economy, but actually that means going beyond and having priorities. What does it really mean when you talk about K economy? How do we make sure that the extractive nature in terms of the global and geopolitics is actually being addressed? Because we will not be able to really go further unless we are addressing that. So I think also ensuring that there is support for universal and quality public services. So for really this to be meaningful, we really need to push back against privatization and also the commodification of care services, because this is really tied in ensuring that public service and care workers are well paid. They also have access to public services. So that's also key in terms of recognizing. Yeah.
Thank you very much. And the rest of you do put questions in the chat box. I've got lots I want to ask, but I'm prepared to share if others also have some. Memory mentioned care workers again, and I just wanted to come back to that. Divya and Petra also mentioned that. Petra, I don't know German protocol, but if I may call you Petra, that you mentioned decent work as well. What needs to happen to ensure that the usually women who provide paid care work, usually underpaid, what do we need to do, both not just domestically but also internationally, to improve their conditions? And Divya and Emilia, if you want to come in on that as well, please do.
Thank you. Yes. Well, let me start by answering from the domestic perspective again, because I'm representing here the ministry that's on gender equality in the domestic sphere. I'd say one important issue is the principle of equal pay, to prolong this principle to not only equal pay for equal worth, but the question on how do you define the balance between different professions. And we see that in Germany. It's been a discussion now maybe for decades on how do you value care work for humans vis-a-vis technical professions. So that's one important starting point. The other one that we've followed in Germany during the last year is also the question of career paths in care work, because very typical for the care sector, for the care infrastructure, is that you have certain types, but you don't have like career paths as you have in other sectors of the economy. This is also an important factor. And very important also for Germany and other countries is the work in private households that's partly not regulated, that's partly coming in forms of also human trafficking or labor exploitation. So really to put measures in place to counter such forms of work and to make it possible to have decent wages also for care workers, caregivers in private households.
Thank you. Divi, you mentioned health care workers as well. Do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I think one is to really understand the gravity of the situation. I think people who are in this space know the problems and the challenges, but people who are make those decisions can't really see the investment case of why this is important and how women and gender diverse people contribute to this. I think what Anita said, the role of context matter, and like culturally at times it's sort of the acceptable norms. And so like really working on social and cultural norms to address challenges around decent work matter. You know, obviously organizations like the ILO have done a lot of good work on decent work, and then how do you work with them ensuring the legal and regulatory frameworks are put in place for this? But also just to add the power of feminist organizing and you know, ensuring that our advocacy remains focused on these issues in forums like the G7, but also others like the COP and Generation Equality Forum is important.
Thank you, and I think also as we've done today, of trying to ensure that we don't let the care agenda be just about unpaid care. But to be about paid care work and public services as well. And also when it comes to paid work, not just women's rights organizations organizing, but obviously trade unions and labor organizing and basing decent work around ILO conventions. And the report that Anita mentioned earlier from UN Women has a really interesting fact in there about how the minimum wage is actually the best way to close the gender pay gap. Because so many women are earning below a minimum wage, which I just found useful. You've mentioned, a number of you have mentioned about the importance about creating awareness as well. How do we do that? How do we create awareness to show how important care is? And Emilia, you've talked about how important sustainability issues are. How do we make that connection between care and sustainability so people understand quite how fundamental these issues are?
I mean, recently scientific papers were released, and they're actually calling them the apocalypse papers. And they're talking about the entire devastation of the environmental fields, not only climate change. Actually, if we stop climate change today, the damage to the planetary boundaries are so harsh that there are scientists that are also, that even now are saying that the extinction of humankind is coming in 2040. 2040. So I'm really shocked to go everywhere with all of the information that we have, and we are still talking about situations in silos, and we're not talking about how to transform the structures. So civil society, social movements have a lot of proposals in terms of transforming the global economic and financial institutions and the structures, and even to challenge the global financial architecture, including the IF5, the World Bank, and the IMF's role in uplifting and enhancing all of these practices that are destroying the planet. So I just really think it's not a matter of awareness raising. It's not a matter of sharing information. It is a matter of political will. It is a matter that those who are holding the power and those that are in touch with power and those who are able to regulate that 1% of the world that is really undermining life and well-being in the planet, especially harming the rights of women and those who suffer from multiple discrimination, understand the gravity of the situation and the imminent collapse that is coming to our society. There is no way to put it in a more accessible manner, and yet they keep on refusing their responsibilities and either talking about national policies, which we do not care at this moment when the entire planet is facing destruction, or shying away with siloed proposals with the private sector that is really only deepening the problems. We need common policies, we need public services, we need national care plans, and a whole entire shift, and Memory has already hinted at that. So I think this is time also for the feminist movement in really engaging with larger conversations with other social movements to try to bring about transformation. We cannot just isolate our discussion, our speeches in a time like this.
Thank you, and I think that's what we're trying to do here is to make those links between the different movements, whether it's the labour movement, whether it's the environmental movement, whether it's the care movement. Memory, perhaps you could say a bit more about what have you seen working in your context of creating that political will so that governments recognise the needs for public services, for example, recognise the importance of care within a national economic planning.
Yeah, so I think one of the things that is really important is really investing in shifting gender norms and some of the underlying inequalities, gender discrimination practices. So within the policy making component, in order to build political will, I think a lot still needs to be done in having data beyond the quantitative time use data, but more qualitative data, but also sharing examples in terms of countries where we have seen, where they've embraced the care economy and how it has worked. So I'll give examples. I think there's just a few things that can actually be done in terms of building political will is really strengthening the accountability measures, particularly between member states, and forums like the HLPF, where there's a lot of talk about achievement of SDG 2030. But then when you really come on the ground to see what specific measures, how much investment has been done, how much budget allocations has actually been put forward. So even when we look at supporting, when you look at the global north countries, most of them have not even met the 7% contribution. And when we look at the state we are in terms of where we are globally, I think it's important to even have more goals in terms of percentages, which will really make sure they are shifting the needle. So really making commitments which are honored in terms of making sure it's sustainable, because we talk about sustainability, but how do we sustain when there's still huge inequalities? How do we talk about progressing in development when there isn't feminist movements, women's rights movement are still at the bottom of the ladder in terms of getting resources that can allow them to do the work that they have been doing? We knew before the COVID, we've been saying it, we had the solutions, we were posturing the solutions. We were already looking at feminist macroeconomics, economies, looking at what the future, and I think the feminist movement already had it before the COVID, and now the COVID kind of like addressed the situation as a crisis. Yes, it was a crisis, but there are also deeper issues which still need to be invested. And I think G7 countries, because they lead, they talk of feminist foreign policy. So implementing it and leading should really demonstrate that, they're shifting those inequalities and they're really supporting the work of movements which we're already talking and giving solutions that work.
And remember, you mentioned feminist foreign policy, which is mentioned in the G7. There isn't a commitment to it, which I think is probably the UK's fault. If I know my government well, it mentions the spirit of feminist foreign policy. But maybe we can now just sort of bring this together by talking about, we've talked about the care economy in very different ways between us. But what would be, in each of your contexts, the next steps? And perhaps we can start with you, Petra, is perhaps the best person to tell us about creating political will. How would you increase awareness in the different ministerial tracks so that we actually get some action on this?
Yeah, thank you. Well, for the G7 presidency, we are looking very much forward to the ministerial that we will host in October, and we are also looking forward to the exchange with Women 7 representatives on the one hand, and also the GIAC on the other hand. So we are looking forward to involve all G7 equality ministers in close dialogue also with civil society and the academia on the next steps forward. I think with the gender dashboard, we have an instrument that will be taken over to the next presidencies and will give evidence and will contribute to accountability, as Memory rightly said. And and Germany will continue to hold the issue of care on the agenda, be it in the G7 or in other international fora and organizations. On a European level, we are looking forward to the EU Care Strategy that will be presented by the EU Commission in autumn, that aims at addressing structural weaknesses in the care systems within the EU. So here we will have also instruments on the European level to go on with addressing the substantial and structural barriers that we still face. Of course, on the national level, we will also go forward. We have several commitments. I mentioned them in my first statement, also in the coalition agreement of the current government to strengthen on the one hand the professional infrastructure, and on the other hand put into place incentives for families and partners for an equal share of unpaid care work. Thank you.
Thank you. Divya, I'm going to ask you a similar question, if I may. What do you think are the kind of practical next steps we should do? And just before you answer, just for everybody else, this is your last chance for a question in the chat box. Otherwise, I'm going to keep going. But Memory and Emilia, after we've heard from Divya, I'm going to give each of you a last word. Tell me in one sentence, you've very clearly outlined the kind of really deep transformative change that is needed. What is the next step on the path to move towards that? But Divya, let's start with you.
Thanks. Just reflecting on this conversation, and I look across the screen, and Memory of fantastic work with Femnet, and as a leader for Action Coalition on Economic Justice and Rights, and Emilia, your work with the Women's Major Group, and Jessica, your work with the W7 and beyond. And I just think, for us as civil society organizations and feminist organizations, how we coordinate better and reinforce our demands across different spaces, so these are not siloed. And so, when organizations like Women Deliver are in sort of the World Health Assembly and other related forums, I think we need to just be more strategic in what we're asking and not sort of reinventing the wheel each time. There was an interesting analysis of this year's G7 and all the W7 engagement group demands. There were over 600 demands. And I just think like better coordination and reinforcing our asks. And while there is acknowledgement about accountability at this year's G7, I mean, I think a lot needs to be watched out for in terms of how that's actually going to be implemented and followed through with. Thanks.
Thank you. And Amelia and Memory, before I give you the final word, we've just got one question that I think probably Petra is best suited for you, if that's okay, is whether the EU is working on a development care strategy.
That's a very interesting question, but I have to admit I can't answer it right now.
Okay, no problem. Actually, we've got one more question. Memory, I'm going to give this one to you because I think you've touched on this a fair bit already. Just how can G7 countries support care economies in partner countries through sector-based financial and fiscal measures? So you've already talked to us a bit about resource transfers, but maybe you could just give us a couple of points on that.
Yeah, I think there can be more increased percentages of global financial flows towards service delivery, really supporting service delivery. Because when you talk of the care economy, I think really recognizing that it is the public service, it is the social protection where we need a lot of investment. And, you know, this has mutually reinforcing benefits like increasing, you know, human development, if I'm to use the words, but in addition to that, the well-being of women, the dignity of women and girls as well. And most importantly, creating egalitarian societies, ending violence against women. So I think there can be more partnerships around, you know, around such development within the social sector, the health sector, the education sector, vis-a-vis some of the underlying deals that we see. I think Anita mentioned around a lot of investment in extractives as well as the military. And I'm just stressing it because I think there has to be that genuine cooperation, but really the support for civic groups and for civic movement. I think we've seen how the labor movements have really dwindled down because we don't have a lot of corporate private sector labor, but on the continent, most of the industries are informal. So really building that and creating services within the informal sector. You know, it could be simple like childcare services, so that women have access, decent. When we even look at you know, inter-country trade, but we didn't mention it. But I think it would be important to also talk about how we should not silo the work that we do. So when you talk of care, we also have to look, I think having the G7 here, it would be amiss not to talk about liberating trade policies, because once trade policies are liberated, there's more access to finances, there's more integral, I mean, so I think there are a lot of reinforcing where, yes, we push a care economy, but we use a macro level analysis and framework.
Thank you, Memory. And if I may also, just this is a piece of work actually that we did with FemNet, was looking at the role of private investment in providing public services and some of the real dangers of private investment, particularly public-private partnerships. And certainly coming from the UK, where we've just had an international development strategy that is about to rely very heavily on British private investment, I think it's really important that we push back and say, what's the evidence here and what are the dangers as well as what are the possible benefits? Not just, you know, but not just in terms of human rights abuses and some of the worst abuses that we know of, but also just financially. Quite often it just doesn't make economic sense. So that just something I think in terms of the answer to the question about how can G7 countries support care economies, I think it's about being honest and using evidence-based solutions about the role of private investment in securing equity goals. Sorry that I abused my privilege as moderator there. So what I'm going to do, given that I don't think we've got any more questions, is just do what I'd said I would do before and just give Amelia, and as a final chance, just say, you've said very clearly some of the really major transformative things that need to happen. Given where we are today and with the G7, how do we do that? What's the one thing that we do next on our path towards those transformative strategies?
Yes, thank you. I think what I want to transmit very strongly is that we, people in the Global South, don't feel that the sense of urgency and desperation we feel, the devastation we witness every day, and even the violence we live every day is really felt in the Global North, even with our allies. So we really want to invite you, rather than focusing on issues that seem to be on the realm of gender, to transit to a more political dimension, that is the feminist view, and to really make these linkages, because I really want to congratulate the approach that the German government at least is trying to do in bringing feminist and decolonial. So you cannot just have just one discussion on care and another separate on decolonial. It has to be linked together. We cannot abstract what is care without decolonial, because that is at the source of the moment. So this is why I also wanted to say that it is more important from us in the Global South to hear from you in Germany that you need to stop pushing the G7 as well into a more legitimate and democratic multilateral system. That means the G7 is not legitimate, it's not democratic, it doesn't speak for ourselves, it actually speaks for the power of wealth and concentration of money and privatization and financialization of all of the public services, and that is really doing a lot of harm. The G7 should be a commitment to hold the ground, to be held accountable, to take proper steps with the funding they have, to pay reparations and to stop the harm that they're doing. This is what we need from the G7 the most, and to turn back the democratic power and voice into the UN, where we have one country, one voice, and all of the smaller countries, the Global South countries, can also have a say at the table. So we are pleading to all of you into these larger alliances and these discussions that you are starting internally, and we congratulate you from that, to push yourselves even harder and to become real allies, because this is what we need the most right now. So I really want to say I really value the opportunity to speak in this voice and keep on engaging with this very hard but very crucial conversation in this moment in time. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Amelia. And I think that's a really good place to bring this together, of that interlinkage between care, between ecological concerns, and between decolonization is a nexus that we can't untangle. They all work together, and that was underlying a lot of, I think, what was coming through with a lot of what you were saying, Memory, as well. We're going to round it up there. I thank you so much, all of you, for your presentations. I think what we've shown is what an important topic this is, but also what a rich and complex topic this is, and how many different ways there are to engage in it. And I have to say, having been working on this for a long time, it's really exciting to me to see how we've moved on from the days where we talked only about unpaid care towards really understanding, or starting to understand, the different connections between everything. I think I'm going to pass over to Caroline now, who's going to say thank you to everybody. It's not, I feel impolite not doing it, but I think it's Caroline's job, but I will say it anyway. Thank you so much to everyone, but I'll pass over to Caroline.
Thank you, Jessica. It was such a great panel, and thank you all for participating and for joining us today. And many have told us that they regret not being able due to time reasons and others. So I'm happy to tell you this, the recording of the session today will be available already tomorrow on our website, and we will of course inform all the interested parties about this. I just want to finish with some spotlights. So pandemic has highlighted large care burden, national care plans. We need national care plans, context matter. We need more partnerships, no silos. We need more awareness and also more commitments. We need feminist transformation. And I might want to finish with a quote I really liked from Anita Bhatia: "What we spend on bombs and rockets, we should spend on care." And thank you all for being with us tonight, and or at least in Berlin, it's tonight. And I wish you a wonderful, wonderful day, and keep the discussion going on. See you soon. Goodbye.